In this video, I'll look at putting colliders on several of the Zombie Toys props, and also the walls we'll use as part of our environment. For placing colliders on objects and other preparatory work before you assemble the main scene, it's a good idea to work in a blank or scratch scene. This will let you work on just one object in general and even lighting conditions, so you can really see what's going on as you're fitting out the different pieces. To begin, take the stool object from the Assets, Models, Environment folder and drag it from the project window into the hierarchy. Remember that dragging an object from the project into the hierarchy positions that object at whatever coordinates it was exported with. In this case, this is exported at 0, 0, 0 with a rotation of 0, 0, 0 as well. It's important to examine the object you're going to use in the context of the gameplay and game mechanic, and this will inform how you put colliders on. I'll orbit around a bit, holding Alt and the left mouse button. What we can see in here is that this stool has 4 legs with a good amount of space between. The legs are spaced widely enough that we need to let our characters be able to pass through. Additionally, it's got a disc top with 8 holes in it. None of our characters can jump, and there's nothing in our scene that's going to fly up and bounce off the top. What this tells us then is that we need 4 separate colliders, one for each leg, and no collider for the top of the stool. Lastly, the legs are round. What this means in terms of our colliders is that we need round colliders so a character can bump into the leg and slide around the surface. This means that a box collider won't work because there would be a corner in the collider a character might stick on. This would be odd to see in the game, where a character would seem to stick on an invisible piece of the leg. What I'll use then are capsule colliders. Choose Component, Physics, and Capsule Collider from the top menu. This creates a capsule collider sized by the bounding box of the object, so it looks almost like a sphere. First, let's reduce the size of this collider. Click and drag on the label, Radius, and reduce the size of that capsule. As we reduce the radius, we see the long sides of the capsule emerge. I brought mine down to about 0.45, and I'll verify that in the top view, making sure it's the right size for the legs. I'll click on the Y-axis and then change from perspective over to an isometric. Lastly, I'll switch from shaded over to wireframe, and I can see the capsule on that stool. I'll zoom in and move the capsule around by moving its center on the X, Y, and Z axes. First, I'll click and drag on the X, positioning it over on the leg. Then I'll use the Z axis and pull it up. I'm going to center this collider as well as I can on the leg. As you can see, I've got my collider slightly larger than the leg diameter. What this will let me do is have a character collide apparently with the leg, but prevent any clipping of the character passing through that leg geometry. You may want to bring down this radius just a little bit more, maybe into the 0.35 range. This way it's a close fit, but has a little bit of room around it, again so a character doesn't collide or clip through that leg geometry. Now I'll duplicate this collider. Click on the cog icon, or gear, and choose Copy Component. Then, click again on that gear icon and paste component as new. Now there are 2 overlapping capsule colliders on this stool. I'm going to use the X-axis here on the second collider and slide it over onto the next leg. Repeat this process twice more, so you have a capsule collider for each leg. Click on the gear icon and paste as new. There's our third, again centered on the first, and I'll use the Z-axis this time to pull it down. Once more, click on that cog icon, copy that last or third capsule, and paste as new. Then use the X-axis on now the 4th capsule to slide it into place. If you'd like them to line up exactly, go up and look at the second capsule. We can see that the X is at 2.27. I've got mine at 2.28, which is close enough, although I could put in the exact value if needed. Now let's switch back over to a shaded view and back to a perspective. Then hold Alt or Option and the left mouse button and spin around. We've got our colliders created on the stool. They're low enough that a character can't pass underneath, and high enough that a character can't pass through. The colliders are round, so characters bumping into those legs will slide around them instead of sticking on a corner, and there's no collider for the top because we don't need one. Let's take this model then and drag it over into the prefabs and look at one more instance here. I'll take this stool object and drag it into my prefabs folder in the environment. Now that stool is a prefab with its colliders ready for implementation in the game. Go through the rest of the props and apply colliders as needed, looking for ways to optimize the colliders based on the geometry of that object. Browse back into the Assets Models Environment folder, and let's create colliders for the wall objects. Because I've already got that stool prefab created, I'm going to delete it from the scene, either right-clicking on it in the hierarchy and choosing Delete, or pressing Delete or Command Delete on a Mac. It's still there in the prefabs folder, ready for implementation in the final scene. Take the wall object and drag it into the hierarchy. Press F to frame in on that selection, and Alt-Option to spin around. These are the walls for the game. This game is going to be shown third-person isometric view, so we only need these two walls. Right now they don't have any colliders on them, and we only need colliders really along the baseboard, as again our characters are small and nobody can jump. One thing to note on the wall then is that there is a hole here, a mouse hole, in the baseboard, and this is actually going to be a spawn point later in our level. So we need to make sure we don't block this with colliders. To create colliders for the wall then, we'll use box colliders. First though, open up that wall object, looking at the hierarchy. We've got the wall, which is actually the walls and baseboard, and the wall star. So it's important to get the colliders on the right object. The star does not need collision. I'll pick wall and choose Component, Physics, and Box Collider. And this creates a box collider that's sized to, again, the bounding box of that wall. I've pressed F to frame in on that selection, and I'll scroll in a bit. I'm going to edit the collider, clicking on the Edit Collider button, and that gives me a green dot in the center of each side of that collider. What this lets you do on colliders then is to drag that dot and interactively size up or down that collider in the view. I'll take this collider and size it down to just hit the baseboard and some of the wall, making sure that I really capture all of the wall my characters are going to interact with. Again, we don't need a collider up high because nobody's going to be firing anything up and nobody can jump. I'll make this collider just slightly wider than the baseboard. Again, clicking and dragging on the green dot in the center of each side to size that collider down. Making that collider slightly larger in this case prevents any clipping, making sure that characters can slide along this object but not inadvertently clip an ear or a trunk through. Let's make the next collider for the other wall. We can either clone this collider or create a new one. What I'm going to do is make a new collider, again with the wall object selected, choosing Component, Physics, and Box Collider. I'll scroll back a bit, pan over, holding Alt-Option and clicking the mouse wheel, and editing that collider. I'll size this collider down to just slightly larger than the baseboard, pick the top dot and reduce the height, roughly matching the other collider, and then moving in the end, making sure that this collider doesn't clip through that mouse hole, as this again will be a spawn point for our enemies. I'll zoom in and bring that collider just to the edge. Remember, if you deselect a collider as I just did, you can always reselect that object and enter Edit Collider mode again. I've sized this collider down just to the edge of that mouse hole. I'm going to check it in a top view. It's important when you've got objects that aren't exactly rectilinear to check in multiple views to make sure your colliders are in the right place. I'll switch to a wireframe and scrub over to see. What we can see here is that actually there's a bit of a room behind that mouse hole. So we need to make sure actually that the collider is just slightly smaller so that our enemies can spawn cleanly inside this little room and come out the mouse hole, bounded by these colliders. Now let's clone this collider and move it to the other side of the mouse hole. For this, click on the gear icon, choose Copy Component, and then Paste as New. we'll take this new collider and move it down. For this, I'll use the Z-axis, sliding it down along the wall by clicking and dragging right on that Z title. I'll zoom in, making sure it's just outside of that mouse hole again. And then shorten it on the other side. I'll click on the Edit Collider button, and bring in that last side. I'll switch back over to a perspective view and orbit around. These are the colliders for our wall object. On colliders like this, get them close enough in size. If it looks right and behaves right, it's right. We don't have to be as exact on the values on this necessarily as we do on the function of the colliders. Now that we've got a good idea of how to establish colliders on our objects, go through and put colliders and the other props in here. Things like the fire truck, for example, may just need a box. The floor needs a box collider. The robot may be a collection of boxes, and the train may have several boxes or a sphere on it. It's best to keep your colliders simple, optimizing wherever possible, and always looking at collider placement in the context of gameplay and interaction.